Bleeding. I've got to stop the bleeding quickly. If I don't do anything, I'm gonna die. I took a bungee cord from my pocket and wrapped it tightly around my lower arm to stop the bleeding. Looking below, I saw that we were now over Tulagi Harbour at about 1,000. This is a bad place to be. If those Grummans come back, we'll be sitting ducks. I slammed the throttle forward and headed northwest. We were flying full speed over the ocean. Yashiro and Watanabe seemed to be okay. I've got to take these guys somewhere safe. I can't neglect my responsibility as a pilot. It would be unforgivable for me to take these men with me on the road to death just because I'm hurt. I was starting to calm down and become more aware of our situation. I now realized how precious life really was. "I'm going to put us down off the west coast of Guadalcanal," I yelled. I remembered the instructions we received just before takeoff. If I ditched just offshore, we could escape into the jungle where our troops were. I had Yashiro dump our bomb into the sea. This made the airplane much lighter and reduced fuel consumption. I had to keep flying with my left hand until we found a place to ditch. If we were landing on a runway, I could do just fine with my left hand. But ditching was totally different. I wasn't sure whether I could do it left-handed. I looked around but couldn't see any Grummans chasing us. We continued northwest. The engine was running fine. I looked down at my mangled right hand lying in my lap. So I too have become one of the war-wounded, a man without a right hand. This is the end of my career as a Navy pilot. I'll never fly again. Only a few moments ago I was determined to throw away my life, but now that I wanted to live, I was deeply saddened by the fact that I would no longer be able to fly. Tears began pouring down my cheeks. Okay, stop crying. You lost your hand, but at least you're alive. That's nothing to cry about. Still, I wonder what my old mother will say when she sees me in such a pitiful condition. She's a strong woman, though, so she might not be too upset. The wound was now starting to hurt. The pain ran all the way up to my right shoulder. It would probably be best to raise my arm above my shoulder. But at least the bleeding had stopped, so I wasn't worried about the pain. Still, it was bad enough that it contorted my face. Using my left hand, I tried to lift my right stub as far above my head as possible, but the pain became unbearable. Soon my head began to throb painfully. I was determined to make it to our destination. I pushed the throttle forward and got us up to 140 knots. The plane could maintain its normal cruising speed of 130 knots without being pushed. But now that felt unbearably slow. I had to get everything out of her I could, so I kept the RPM up. To withstand this would be my last request of her. "Hey, Maury, does it hurt? Hang in there. We're almost there." From time to time, Yashiro would yell words of encouragement. He's trying to keep my spirits up. His words seemed to make the pain more bearable. We finally reached Cape Esperance. If I could just stay airborne for another 3 miles, we'd reach the shoreline we were trying for. We'd been told that the beach was rocky, not sandy. That would make the ditching tricky. My right arm was growing numb. I was very thirsty. My throat felt parched. I tried to swallow but couldn't. At last we were over the jungle. We were still at 1,000. As we came screaming over the shoreline, I searched for a stretch without rocks. "You guys in the jungle, look at the red Hinomaru on the plain. We're going to ditch. Come out and give us a hand." I flew in a wide arc, found a suitable place and prepared to set her down. I had a lot to do because I had to use my left hand to operate the throttle and fly the airplane, but I figured somehow I could pull it off. "Get ready to ditch," I yelled. They seemed pretty relaxed back there because they answered in their normal voices. Okay, this should do it. I took 3 deep breaths to calm myself and configured the plane for landing. I lowered the flaps and let us descend towards the water. Flying with my left hand, it again occurred to me that this would probably be my final flight. For some reason, this thought helped me relax. At 15 feet, I switched off the mags. I put my feet on the instrument panel, braced for impact, and put the plane in a glide. 10 feet, 5 feet, 3 feet. By now I had the stick full back. There, tail wheels in the water. This was followed by a mighty splash, and we came quickly to a stop. The shock was tremendous, but we were all safe. Seeing that Yashiro and Watanabe were uninjured brought tears of joy to my eyes. After saying goodbye to our faithful airplane, the three of us jumped into the ocean and headed for shore. It occurred to me that I seemed to have an affinity for landing in the ocean. Since the beginning of East Asian War, this was my third ditching. Somehow we made our way to shore. Looking back at the airplane, it was apparent that we'd landed in very shallow water. The rudder section was still above the water, rocking back gently in the waves. Just as we were clambering out of the water, a group of 10 or so army troops came out of the jungle towards us. "Hey!" one of them shouted. "Run into the jungle quickly! It's dangerous out there!" If they see even one person, they'll start dropping bombs. The way they were going on, it must in fact be quite dangerous out in the open. "Look," said one of them. "The pilot got shot in the hand. Quick, get him to the field hospital." I was on the verge of passing out. Hearing those words was a huge relief. Two of them put my arms around their shoulders and helped me into the jungle. The so-called field hospital turned out to be a shack under a large tree. They didn't have much equipment, but merely the fact that they could help me was a tremendous relief. With the relaxation of the immense tension I'd been under, I suddenly felt all my strength depart. At the same instant, a wave of unbearable pain swept over me. While I should have been giving thanks to even be alive, all I now cared about was getting relief from the pain. "Doctor," I moaned, "amputate my hand." "Not so fast," he said. "Your wound's not all that bad. We could probably cut it off, but since you're Navy, a Navy doctor should have a look at you." "I don't care what you do. It hurts." "Don't make such a fuss. It's not going to kill you. You're under my care now. You don't have anything to worry about." A medic came over from the Navy Field Hospital with a syringe. They put me under and started operating right away. When I came to the operation was over, my throat was as dry as cotton. "Water! Please, water!" I shouted, thinking I was dreaming. I let out a huge breath of relief. I'd forgotten all about my wound. Seeing my arm wrapped in a huge white bandage brought me back to reality. This was definitely not a dream. I felt a strong craving for a cigarette. "Hey, Doc, can you give me a smoke?" "Well, okay, here." He pulled a single cigarette from a small packet, lit it up, and gave it to me. Looking at it as I took a puff, I saw that the paper was yellowed. "It's pretty mouldy, isn't it?" Hearing me say this, the medic standing nearby leaned over to me and said, "Hey, we don't even have anything to eat here, much less luxuries like tobacco." "You're never going to find anything here even remotely resembling decent tobacco. The cigarette the doctor just gave you was one of the few he's saved for his personal use. He just gave you a very special present out of the kindness of his heart." Oh, great. I just said something really stupid. Feeling like I was wasting a cigarette, I no longer wanted to smoke. To show my thanks, I took just one puff, then stubbed it out with my left hand. Wondering what time it was, I pulled my watch from the pocket of my flight suit and saw that it had stopped at 7:20. The salt water had ruined it. "What time is it?" "About 9:10, the doctor answered brusquely. If it was now after 9, it meant that more than 2 hours had elapsed since our formation broke up over Tulagi. It was only now that I noticed that the doctor who performed my operation was wearing only one star. Although quite a bit older than the rest of the men, he was still just an ensign. He was probably practicing as a civilian when he was drafted into the army. Even I could see that he had more humanity than most career army doctors. "So, where are you from?" I asked. "Tokyo. I was a surgeon at Jiki University Hospital when I was drafted." "So desu ka? I'm from Saitama," I answered, even though he never asked. Perhaps I'd unconsciously taken this liberty because he seemed like such a fundamentally good person, the kind of doctor one could be more sociable with. I had no doubt that he was an excellent physician. "So ka? Saitama, huh? Well, you're going to have some pain for a while, but other than that, you're going to be okay. Yeah, but I've lost my hand. True, but don't worry too much about that. Human beings live on... How are you feeling otherwise? I guess I'm all right. I think I can walk. No walking for you just yet. He had me put on a stretcher, and I was carried to the Navy Field Hospital located deeper in the mountains. It was a very primitive hut build beneath a giant tree that must have been at least 300 years old. Still under the effect of the anesthesia, I drifted off into a deep and dreamless sleep. The next morning when I awoke, my wound was throbbing terribly. But what most bothered me was my hunger. I was absolutely famished. I wondered when breakfast would be served. Yashiro and Watanabe were sitting next to me and looking very hungry themselves. "When are we going to get fed?" I asked innocently. There isn't any food here." "What? What are we supposed to do then?" "Wait a minute. I'll see if I can find something," said Watanabe, and he wandered off very uncertainly. I hadn't eaten anything since the morning of the day before. After about 2 hours, Watanabe returned, holding 10 small ration cans. Finally, I was able to scrounge something. The food storage area for the paymaster is near where we ditched yesterday. When I told them about us, they were grateful that we had at least tried to help them, so they gave me this. I was so hungry I didn't care what it was. What I really craved was some rice, but this was no time to be picky. Watanabe started opening the cans. It was chopped burdock root cooked in soy sauce and sesame oil. Just as we started to eat, we looked up to find at least 10 men standing nearby, observing us with famished eyes. "Could I have just a bite?" said one. "We haven't eaten anything for 10 days, said another. Although we were terribly hungry ourselves, seeing that these men were clearly starving, we had to share. In a few moments, the 10 cans were all empty and licked clean. Wanting to have a smoke after eating, I groped around in the pocket of my flight suit and came up with 5 of 6 waterlogged cigarettes. Thinking they were ruined, I tossed them aside, only to watch others snatch them up greedily. So, this is the sorry state to Guadalcanal has fallen, was all I could think. Once again, I was reminded of the harshness of war. Just then I remembered that we carried emergency rations in our airplane, enough for 7 days. I called some of the nearby soldiers to my bed. "Hey, there's food in our airplane. Watanabe, why don't take some of these guys with you and go get it?" Watanabe must have forgotten this also, as he jumped up excitedly. One of the soldiers sitting nearby laughed ironically and said, "What, you only just remembered that now? Just after you guys ditched, we swam out there and ate it all." He was so matter-of-fact about it that we slumped back in resignation. Another reminder of Guadalcanal's harsh reality. My wound was protected by a mosquito net rather than a blanket, but even when the net merely brushed the wound, I felt a searing pain. Seeing me wince, Yashiro said, "Hurts, doesn't it?" "Nah, just stings a bit," I said through gritted teeth. "You know, I had no idea that your hand had been shot off. One of your fingers flew back onto my seat, so I just thought you just lost a finger. That's why I yelled at you not to crash dive." "Ah, so desuka. I was preparing to cross the river Styx, 18. But when I heard you yelling, I wanted to live again." "Yeah, living is better, but that was a great water landing you made." "Thanks." I looked again at the bandage on my right arm. The thought that I would have to leave the Navy and that I would never fly again brought tears to my eyes. Yashiro and Watanabe turned away and pretended not to notice. "Keep your spirits up," said Yashiro after a few moments. "Ha!" I grunted, and was silent. If only it hadn't tried to make a second attack, I thought. If the Zeros had just stayed with us a little longer. Those 21 heroic airmen that flew with me in Hawaii could have inflicted so much more damage on the enemy. Forget it. No point in thinking about it. What's done is done. No one was in the wrong. They were all fated to do as they did. The morning quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of heavy artillery fire. It seemed to be coming from the beach area below us. I figured the enemy must be preparing for a landing, but when I looked around, no one else seemed to be very concerned. "If the enemy did come after us, there's no way I'd be able to escape," I said to one of the soldiers nearby. "Nah, last night our destroyers unloaded a lot of supplies on the beach. We worked all night, but we couldn't carry it all into the jungle. There's still a lot left down there. The Americans know that, so now they're shelling it." That must have been what all the commotion was about last night. What a waste, I thought. Those sailors risked their lives to land all that food and ammo, and now it's getting blown up. The enemy ships were only about 300 yards offshore. They weren't the least bit afraid of us. If we had even just one airplane, we could make them pay for that. I would have loved to torpedo one of those ships and send all those arseholes to the bottom. I was angry and deeply frustrated, but when I looked around, everyone else seemed to take it for granted and weren't taking much notice. "Why don't we get one of our field guns down there and let 'em have it?" I asked indignantly. "Are you crazy? Their planes would come over and blow it to smithereens. The enemy's got total air superiority. We can't just sit here and do nothing." "Don't worry about it. There's nothing we can do anyway." Hearing this deflated me completely, and I slumped back on my cot. After about an hour, the shelling stopped. Their destroyers must have returned to Tulagi Harbour. I was now hungrier than ever. Watanabe and one of the orderlies went off in search of something to eat. Yashiro was suffering from shrapnel wounds in his right thigh, and he couldn't walk. "Hey, Mori, how are you feeling?" He seemed more worried about me than about himself. "I'm feeling much better. How's your leg?" "I'm going to have the doc pull out the shrapnel later. It's nothing. It'll heal up fast." "Yeah, well, you better get it taken out soon," I said, looking at his injured leg. After about 2 hours, Watanabe and the other guy returned. In their hands, they carefully cradled a mess tin of boiled rice. "Dinner is served," they said with glee. "Can you guys sit up?" "Hey, thanks." When I heard they had food, I sat up so quickly that my head started spinning, so I took a few deep breaths to calm down. "We found this mess kit lying next to a soldier who'd been killed," said Watanabe. "We figured he wouldn't be needing it anymore, so we took it." "Killed, huh? Who was he?" He'd taken part in the attack to take the airfield, but because the reinforcements never arrived, they had to retreat into the mountains. They were up there for about a month with almost nothing to eat. I guess he somehow made it to where we found him, but the malaria and malnutrition got him. He was nothing but skin and bones. "Geez, nothing to eat for a month," I said with a sigh. Only 3 days ago we'd been on the carrier where we had all we could eat, but here these men were struggling just to keep from starving. I felt guilty about complaining just because I hadn't had a decent meal for 2 or 3 days. "Where'd you get the rice?" I asked when I saw the boiled rice inside. "We got a couple cups from the supplies the destroyers landed last night. We boiled it down at the beach." I was really happy that we got some rice, but Watanabe was taking a big chance by boiling it. The enemy knew we were in the jungle, and their P-38s and Grummons were always overhead. If they saw even a wisp of smoke, the bombs and bullets would come raining down. I never ceased to be amazed at how much ammunition they seemed to have. Still, I wondered how they'd managed to boil the rice on the beach undetected. According to Watanabe, they first prepared the kindling and then set the mess kit on top. Then, when there weren't any planes around, they lit the fire and sprinted back into the jungle as fast as they could. After the fire was burned out and there was no more smoke, they ran out and grabbed the kit. Cooked on a fire like that, some of the rice was burned and some was only partially boiled, but we didn't care. To us it looked and smelled delicious. Of course, things didn't always go so smoothly. Sometimes the enemy saw the fires and blew our precious rice all over the beach. Still, we figured the enemy probably enjoyed leisurely breakfasts because mornings before 8 was the safest time to boil rice. Any later than that, and everything got clobbered. From then until sundown, there were always planes patrolling overhead. So during the day, we would just stay hidden in the jungle. Every sunrise would reveal 5 or 6 men who had died during the night of malaria or malnutrition. We witnessed many tearful ceremonies held by survivors for comrades who had died in attacks on the airfield. We could only wonder what our superiors who conceived this strategy were thinking. Dying with a gun in your hand while fighting the enemy was one thing, but being reduced to a walking corpse by starvation and then dying a lonely death on some god-forsaken tropical island, that was the most miserable death imaginable. We had a radio station mounted on a small hilltop in the middle of the jungle. If we tried sending a message, the enemy would immediately locate and destroy it, so all we could do was listen. This was our only link with the outside world, our only way of knowing how the war was going. Every day around noon, a large formation of about 30 bombers and Zeros from Rabaul would attack. We would always sneak out of the jungle and watch the action from the top of a nearby hill. The fighters engaged in vicious dogfights, and some of them invariably went spinning down in flames. We could never tell whether they were enemy planes or ours, but of course we convinced ourselves that they were all enemy planes, because that's what we wanted to believe. On the morning of October 22nd, our troops launched a major attack to retake the airfield, and we received a report that they had succeeded. Now we're going to be okay, I thought. Our planes could bring in ample supplies, and we would no longer have to worry about air attacks. I was very relieved. This good news improved our morale tremendously. Some of the 300 soldiers in the jungle began making preparations to leave. However, that was the last report we received. There was no news on either the 23rd or the 24th. Eventually, we learned that while our troops attacking from the south did make it onto the airfield, those attacking from the west were late in launching their attack. As a result, a series of bloody battles developed in which our troops suffered such heavy losses that they were forced to retreat back into the mountains. When the news of the defeat reached us, we became even more depressed than before. We were overcome with a deep sense of loneliness and isolation. When launching a combined attack, it's important that each unit coordinate its actions with the others. Why did the Western unit execute their attack improperly? If the enemy had only recently occupied the airfield, such tactics might have succeeded. But they'd now had 3 full months to build up their defences, and they had air superiority. How could the commanders expect to succeed with such an uncoordinated attack under these conditions? We not only suffered grave losses, our troops were now trapped in the jungle with no way out. Additionally, the regular once-a-day attacks by our land-based planes were not nearly enough to get the job done. However many enemy planes we managed to shoot down, they could quickly fly up 40 or 50 replacements from the south. But when our planes went down, they couldn't be so easily replaced. Even if our air group started out with 50 planes, after 10 or 20 days, only half were still operational, and the fight was still ongoing. In another 2 or 3 months, we wouldn't have any planes left at all. The morale of our pilots also had its limits. They were becoming very frustrated and disillusioned. On the evening of October 26th, we received a welcome radio message. In a sea battle in the South Pacific, our forces had sunk 4 enemy carriers and inflicted heavy damage on a battleship, cruiser, and destroyers. Shouts of "Banzai" echoed through the jungle. This news lifted our spirits immensely. At the same time, I couldn't hide my feelings of disappointment. If I hadn't been sitting here wounded, I would probably have taken part in that glorious battle. I would have launched a torpedo at the enemy ships and exacted some revenge on them for Midway. Just when I had come to terms with my injury and was beginning to accept my changed situation, this news reignited my warrior spirit. With anger and bitterness, I recalled the events of October 17th, which were the cause of all this. "Hey, Yashiro, sorry I got shot up. Otherwise, we'd have taken part in that battle." "Can't be helped. No point in worrying about it." Watanabe, however, wore a look of disappointment. But unlike me, he was still healthy. He'd have the chance to fight again. 18 days had now passed since we ditched. It was around that time that 2 soldiers came tramping back from that area, carrying 2 boxes of remains on their backs. They told us that another bomber had crash-landed in the jungle on the same day as us. On November 3rd, we were astonished when Petty Officer Hisao Sato, lead pilot of the second flight on Junyo, suddenly turned up in the jungle with us. Like us, his plane had also been shot up, and his oil tank had been holed. He couldn't make it back to the carrier, so he crash-landed in the jungle just a couple of miles west of where I ditched. Unfortunately, his observer, Lieutenant Kurihara, and rear gunner had both been killed in the air battle. One of our patrols found him and helped him cremate his 2 crewmen. Those were the 2 men who had brought back the remains. We were overjoyed at this unexpected meeting. Over the next few days, the 4 of us discussed the incidents of that fateful day in great detail. Although we thought the Zeros had left us too soon, we all agreed that the biggest mistake was calling off the first attack and attempting to initiate a second. While the 9 attack planes from Hio carried out their attack successfully and all returned safely to the carrier, the 8 planes in our flight were all shot down. The 20 airmen, including flight leader Ito, all died heroic deaths. The 4 of us were the only survivors. Because Satu was in excellent health, he left that night for Rabaul on one of our destroyers. When he got back to Junyo, he would almost certainly be promoted to warrant officer. Before long, it became too dangerous to land supplies by destroyers, and instead submarines were used for the nightly supply runs. Of course, the subs not only couldn't carry as much, they had to stand offshore when unloading. There they were more exposed to currents, waves, and tidal changes. Light signals were used to signal the troops on shore that the supplies were ready. But of course, the enemy could also see the lights. As if that weren't bad enough, the area was also infested with crocodiles. When the soldiers saw the signal, they would start dragging the floating supplies ashore. The Americans knew what was going on, and they would soon start firing on them. The back-breaking work would have been difficult enough for men in good health, but our troops were malnourished, suffering from malaria, and eating nothing but lizards and bugs. A hospital is where they all belonged. The rice was shipped in metal drums, only partially filled, so they would float. But they were still so heavy that it took 7 or 8 men to move them. Some of them just had to be cut loose and abandoned. The next day, the enemy soldiers would come to retrieve the drums, and our men would shoot at them. The winner in these battles was whoever ended up with the food. That rice which did reach us was all given to the soldiers going into battle, while the rest of us survived on plants and whatever small animals we could catch. Because we had no salt, we would go down to the beach and drink some seawater. It was a miserable way to live. Gato, Guadalcanal Island, had in fact become Gato, Starvation Island. Finally, on November 5th, we received a radio message that 16 destroyers would be coming down Esperance Strait at 2 a.m. on November 6th to evacuate the island. Those wounded men who were able to walk were told to gather at the beach by 10 that evening. Yashiro's leg was now well enough for him to walk, and we were very thankful to be returning to our carrier and escaping the horrors of this Buddhist hell of hungry spirits. When the news of our imminent rescue arrived, I felt like jumping for joy. But my joy was short-lived, for in the next instant I thought of the hundreds of my fellow soldiers who were being left behind. Before leaving, I made a point to thank the army doctor, Dr. Kyo Sasa, now with his own practice in Miyagi Prefecture, Wakamatsu, and the Navy Doctor Lieutenant Ito from Tokyo. Then, for the last time, the 50 or so of us walking wounded walked out of the jungle where we had suffered so much. At 1 a.m. on the morning of the 6th, the destroyer Shirayuki came in close to shore. We clambered into a large army skiff and were taken out to her. At the same time, one of the destroyers ahead of us started shelling the enemy with its main guns. As soon as everyone was on board, the destroyers left the area at full speed. Star shells were going off in the near distance, making for quite a show. The enemy ships were also shooting at us, and geysers of bright white water rose up all around us. Eventually, we were out of the battle area, and the ship returned to normal operation. Because our stomachs were still too weak to take solid food, we were served pickled plums and rice gruel. Munching contentedly on my bowl of gruel, I very much wanted to share it with our comrades still suffering on Guadalcanal. By the next day, we were out of range of the enemy's aircraft and were finally able to relax. We lounged about on the destroyer's deck, bathing in the warm, tropical sunshine. It felt wonderful to be at sea again, the destroyer knifing its way through the dark blue swells. Fortunately, Shirayuki was headed directly for Truk without stopping on the way in Rabaul. After 5 days at sea, we sailed into the naval harbour at Truk. It felt great to be back. Junior was resting quietly at anchor. After my 20-day absence, she looked absolutely majestic. I couldn't wait to get on board and see all my friends. A boat came for us, and a few minutes later, I was walking up the gangway on the ship's side. My first stop was to see the officer on duty. He told me that the ship would be leaving port on a mission in 30 minutes. I was ordered to quickly gather my belongings and report to the 4th Hospital on Truk Island. I'd finally made it back to the carrier, and now they were kicking me off in 30 minutes. I hurried down to the wardroom where I found 4 or 5 officers, none of whom I knew. Still wearing my filthy flight suit, gaunt with malnutrition, and with my arm all bandaged up, I must have made quite a sight. They looked me over with suspicion and weren't the least bit sociable. Not knowing what to say, I simply shouted out, "Petty Officer First Class Maury, returning to the ship." I then ran out of the wardroom and headed to the flight crew quarters. Here, too, there were a lot of unfamiliar faces, but there were many that I knew. It felt wonderful to at last be back where I belonged. "Hey, Maury, good to have you back." "We thought you went in. Glad you're okay." Looking down at my right arm, I felt the tears well up in my eyes. "Stop it," I told myself. "They're all happy to see me, but I'm no good for anything anymore." "Maury, cheer up. Don't take it so hard." I looked down, nodded, and tried to control my emotions. The room once again livened up, and soon we were all chatting as if I'd never been away. Unfortunately, Junior was due to sail for Guadalcanal in 30 minutes, and I had to disembark. Couldn't be helped. Those 30 minutes spent with my fellow airmen were very precious to me. I realized that I was one of the luckiest people in the world, and had no right to ask for anything more. It was then I determined to be happy no matter what. I would say goodbye to my comrades in arms with a cheerful smile. Before long, the ship's loudspeaker blared out, "Petty Officer Maury is disembarking. Everyone on deck to see him off." The other pilots carried my duffel bag. I said goodbye to the duty officer, then walked down the ship's ladder into a launch. After all my travails, I'd finally made it back to my carrier, only to have to leave it immediately. All that awaited me now was the life of a hospital patient. As the launch moved off, I gazed back longingly at Junyo. The entire crew was on deck waving their caps and giving me a send-off. "Stay healthy, Maury. Keep your spirits up." Their well-meaning shouts of encouragement did little to ease my feelings, dejection and abandonment. I knew that I should be thankful and felt guilty about letting my emotions show. I resolved to keep my head up and get on with life. "Sayonara, everyone! May all your future battles be victories," I shouted at the top of my lungs, and once again came the tears. With my left hand, I waved to the crew as Junyo gradually fell away astern. When I could no longer make out the figures on deck, I turned around and saw that we were almost at the wharf. No sooner had I stepped off onto land than the launch hurried busily off on another errand. I sat down on the wharf and gazed across the harbour at Junyo. She would soon be departing on an important mission. It was extremely kind of Captain Okada to have the crew give me such a warm send-off. Slowly, the massive carrier got underway and made her way out the narrow harbour entrance. I continued watching her until she was no more than a dot the horizon. On November 15th, after a few days of treatment at Truk Hospital No. 4, I boarded Yasukuni Maru for the Naval Hospital at Kure. It was my first trip on a passenger ship, and I enjoyed it immensely. They even put me up in a first-class cabin. When I asked why, they said the captain wanted to express his appreciation for my service as a pilot. While relaxing in my cabin, I had time to reflect on the war. It was clear to me that the deteriorating situation at Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a downward path for Japan's war effort. I heard that Warrant Tasukawa, who had given me his care package after the defeat at Midway, had also been shot down and killed over Guadalcanal. He gave everything he had for our country, including that most precious gift of all. Visions of my many comrades who had also fallen from the sky came before me, making sleep impossible. After 2 or 3 days of loafing around in the quiet cabin, I began to grow bored. Although it was quite luxurious, with a bathroom and fan, I felt like I didn't belong there. I suppose I was just a third-class kind of guy. After 8 comfortable days, Yasukuni Maru dropped anchor in the naval harbour at Kure on November 23rd. To finally return to Japan after so long and eventful an absence lifted my spirits immeasurably. It felt so good to be back. After thanking the captain and first mate, I disembarked and was admitted to the Kure Naval Hospital. I changed into a white patient gown and a nurse helped me organise my things. I then lay down in bed. Once again, I confronted that fact that I was now one of the war wounded. It wasn't a good feeling, but it was pointless to dwell on it. I resolved to get well as quickly as possible and build a new life for myself. On December 21st, I was transferred to the Yokosuka Naval Hospital. Writing letters had been forbidden at Kure, but here I could at last write a letter to my family. They must have rushed off as soon as they read my letter. For only a few days later, my mother and younger brother arrived for a visit. A nurse called for me and escorted me to the visiting room. Attempting to maintain my composure, I walked briskly into the room. But the moment I saw my mother's face, I felt the tears come to my eyes. Somehow I was able to compose myself, and I tried to speak nonchalantly. "How are you?" she said. "Ah," I lost my hand. "Where?" "Here!" And I pulled up my sleeve and showed her. I saw a look of deep consternation flash across her face, but she immediately controlled herself. Once again, I was reminded of how strong she was. "It's wonderful to have you back," she said. She may have been weeping inside, but she said nothing more about it. She was no doubt relieved to see me in such relatively good shape. After a bit, I told her about everyone else in our flight getting wiped out and about the awful conditions on Guadalcanal. On hearing this, her eyes filled with tears. We then chatted happily for some time about home, family, and village affairs. "Take care of yourself. Get well quickly," she said. They then returned to our village during the last month of the year while our country was at war. I felt very fortunate to be alive and to see my mother again. Losing my right hand was nothing to be crying about. One would be punished for such self-pity. On the evening of December 28th, an army surgeon performed plastic surgery on my hand. Then, with the arrival of the new year, all the patients gathered on the roof where the hospital head led us in prayer for the troops at the front. Every Sunday, we received visits from a civilian patient support group. These events were the high point of our week, so we always looked forward to Sundays. While recuperating in my room in the plastic surgery department, I learned that Lieutenant Hakuji Kakuno, the leader of Hiryu's torpedo bomber group, was also a patient at the hospital. The lieutenant and I had become friends during base training prior to Soryu's departure. During the Midway attack, Lieutenant Kakuno's flight was attacked by Grumman's just before letting go of their bombs, and he was hit in the left ankle by one of their slugs. In spite of the pain and tremendous loss of blood, he completed his bombing run, inflicting significant damage on the enemy positions. Then, while still flying, he gave himself emergency first aid and flew back to the carrier, a flight of over 1 hour in duration. I'd heard of his exploits on the destroyer that picked me up after the battle, and it made a great impression on me. Afterwards, they had to amputate his left leg below the knee, and that's why we were in the same department. Every time I visited the lieutenant in his room, his indomitable spirit impressed me. Even if our bodies are crippled, we cannot allow ourselves to become mentally crippled. His words have remained with me ever since. I firmly believe that much of what I am today I owed to Lieutenant Kakuno's guidance. While recovering in the hospital, we were not allowed to let others help us. This was so we could learn to care for ourselves. We soon learned to bathe, wash our clothing, get our meals, and perform the other tasks of daily living. The old proverb was very true. You can do it if you try. This made the future seem much brighter. It was sometime in May that I received a visit from Lieutenant Nagai, our flight leader during the attack on Pearl Harbor. He'd been reassigned to the airbase at Yokosuka. "Why don't you join the aerial photography section?" he suggested enthusiastically. "If you leave the Navy, you might have a hard time earning a living with your injury." I told him that I probably wouldn't be suited for that kind of work and that I was requesting my discharge from the Navy. In both his official duties and private behaviour, Lieutenant Nagai was a man of impeccable character. Some time after this, he was again sent to the front where he died a heroic death in the skies over Saipan Harbour. Still, my emotional bonds with the sky were not completely severed. I still dreamed of flying. The dreams were always the same. I was flying my airplane and returning to the carrier. My hand was uninjured. When I awoke, my right arm always hurt. I would realise, it was only a dream. At such times I was afflicted with an indescribable feeling of loss. Towards the end of April, Air Staff Officer Okumiya paid me a visit. He had returned to the home islands on important business and took a few hours from his busy schedule to see me. He also suggested repeatedly that I should stay in the Navy. However, I had already decided on a different path for my future. The truth was that the thought of remaining in the Navy but not being able to fly was simply unbearable. "Flight Leader Nagai also made me an offer not too long ago," I said. "I thought about it long and hard, but my mind's made up." "So, Kay. Well, I understand, but you may have trouble finding a job. Remember, you can come and see me any time." After parting, I listened to his footsteps echoing in the hallway and felt thankful for having superiors who were concerned about my well-being. When he got to the end of the hall, he turned and said, "I'll see to it that you get a promotion when you're discharged from the hospital." Lieutenant Kakuno was discharged just before me and went off to Kasumigara Air Base. On June 18, 1943, after 8 months of rehabilitation, I left to return to my hometown. The day before leaving, I was promoted 1 rank to warrant officer as thanks for my service. With the naval band playing Hotaru no Hikari, my career as a naval aviator came to an end, and I took my first resolute steps towards the new life awaiting me. However, the military wasn't quite done with me yet. On July 15, 1944, I was drafted into the Navy as a result of Imperial Edict 604. When the war ended, I was serving with the Yatabe Air Group in Yamagata. Even today, I need merely close my eyes to recall the events of that fateful day in the skies over Guadalcanal. The luminescent greens and bright red are imprinted on my retina as vividly as if it had all happened only yesterday. At times it seems hard to believe that I really saw a jungle green so brilliant, or that my blood was so red. This is when the memories come flooding back, and it seems impossible that already 30 years have passed. 30 years, only 2 words, but a long time in a human life, enough to encompass youth, a war and the chaos of defeat and famine. For those of us who lived through it, the road was long. Yet for all that I still feel very fortunate to have been a pilot. Of course, it wasn't easy, and there were plenty of hard times. It was no small thing to fly a torpedo bomber that was virtually defenceless, or to get my right hand shot off. No, these were not small things. For 30 years now, my prosthetic right hand covered by a white glove has been hanging at my side. Yet in spite of all this, even today I consider myself very fortunate to have been a pilot. I say this not out of sentimentality or pride, but rather from the joy that comes of taking leave of the earth and seeing and experiencing all those things that only pilots know. This includes the stress of life and death battles in the sky, as well as the satisfaction and moments of enlightenment that are given only to those who spend their days in the limitless skies. These experiences are precious beyond measure. If I had to pay for them with my right hand, so be it. That was small payment for what I've been given in return. After all that, I now take pride in knowing that I can face any adversity with a smile, see a wider world, and face life with equanimity. The torpedo bombers of that era had a crew of 3: pilot, observer, radio man. If the plane should become uncontrollable and the crew should have to bail out, the pilot could only bail out after the other 2 were safely away. However, a delay of only 1 second in this situation could result in a deadly crash. A pilot must keep this in mind at all times while flying. The pilot must keep a close eye on the lead plane, while also being aware of the number 2 and 3 planes in the formation. This, in addition to monitoring the 16 instruments on the panel and watching out for enemy aircraft. At times like this, one body seems totally inadequate to perform all the necessary tasks. A pilot must also be able to make split decisions during an attack that will decide the success or failure of the mission. Truly, a pilot's responsibilities are heavy indeed. Even when on the ground, the pilot has all these things on his mind. Thus, it is of primary importance that he maintain good health and stay fit, for only then can he fully exercise his knowledge, abilities, and concentration. When training for torpedo launching, if the water depth was shallow, we would drop the torpedo from a height of only 15 feet and a distance from 150 to 200 yards. This may not sound particularly challenging, but it is in fact extremely difficult, as the slightest miscalculation can result in a miss and a failed attack. To be able to accurately judge the sight picture at a height of 15 feet, we would find some place on land where we could sit at that height and observe the sea surface. After doing this repeatedly, we began to get a feel for this height. By imprinting this feeling into our brains, we sought to eliminate the possibility of missing when the time came for the real thing. The purpose of all this training was to ensure that we could quickly make the correct decisions in a variety of situations. Taking on these myriad responsibilities required courage, the courage to make decisions and then act on them. It is with this spirit that with my faithful airplane, I was able to confront these extreme situations and give it everything I had. Now, looking back on it all, I can see that this spirit of giving everything is what saw me through. It is why I am alive today. Although my clumsy words do not adequately explain my feelings, I fought for my country with every ounce of my being and with all my strength. If the loss of my hand is my payment for this honour, I do not regret it in the least. I firmly believe that everything that happens is ordained by Providence. I feel truly lucky to have been a pilot.